All right. Welcome to the second episode of Econ Salon. Happy Dasera to all of you and Shubho Bijoya as well, obviously. So let's get down to it today. So this is similar to the way IIH is structured, but not exactly. I will speak for a bit, and then of course I'll also look at whatever questions and comments there are. In the future, we'll have other guests here as well on Econ Salon. I'm doing this essentially because a lot of you who bought my book, that is of course the Nexus, the negotiating the new normal, they had questions related to precisely this issue, which I am calling the Japanification of China's economy, which is why I decided to do this program actually. So let's get to it. So what I see when I say Japanification, what do I mean? Obviously, I mean a state of affairs where there are very high levels of debt, both public and private, right? Including hidden public debt, as in the case of China. It also means a state of affairs where the economy is basically has a tendency towards deflation. You will find that despite all the disruptions in the world, China is still has a CPI, consumer price inflation rate of only around 2.7% at the moment, compared to what is happening in the West, which was in deflation for a while, for a long time after the GFC. China has not been that affected, and China has been exporting deflation for quite some time, since the global financial crisis actually. So, and combined with the aging problem, which will create a problem for financing these debts, basically financing public expenditure from domestic sources, since according to the standard life cycle hypothesis, older people tend to save less. China is very much the way Japan became once the lost decades, just before the lost decades set in. And in Japan also, the lost decades came after the bursting of what was called the Heisei boom, which became the Heisei bubble. And after that burst in 1991, you had those lost decades setting in, because banks were full of non-performing loans mostly linked to the real estate sector. Property prices had crashed, obviously. Those loans had property prices, real estate as collateral. So the collateral coverage also went down, and so on and so forth. So what basically happened was that the toxic balance sheets of various firms who had borrowed from banks became the toxic balance sheets of the banks themselves. And because the Japanese government did not want to go through a whole bunch of foreclosures and bank failures, they allowed the extend and pretend policy to continue with evergreening of loans. But what that meant was there was no other real investment in the economy, which would aid in the restructuring of the economy towards more productive sectors that were emerging at that time. IT related sectors, etc. So you will find that Japan is not a ITES power or anything. Of course, it has very advanced software for its manufacturing enterprises and software that is derived from that. But otherwise, it could not restructure its economy to be a more services-led economy really. And China has already failed to do that. And when Chinese IT firms were innovating at scale, that was not acceptable to the Communist Party of China itself, especially its Mao's faction. So Xi Jinping himself turned on them, and we know what the results are, with Jack Ma disappearing every now and then, etc., etc. So that is I just gave a broad overview of what we are going to talk about. Acha, I'll just take a few of these comments and then I'll come back to what I'm saying. Let's see what's being said. Okay, Pratik Farade says Japan population is small plus land area small, so they can completely micromanage their economy, through which they can work on quality product development model. On the other hand, China's population is big and micromanagement of economy is difficult, so they can't have blue collar jobs and quality product development, so they definitely can't be the same as Japanese eco. They both have different economic model. One can't compare large scale countries model to small scale country model. No, not really. This is actually not accurate, because I'll tell you why. they have the same model. When you look at Japan, China as a large country, you're forgetting that China's population is essentially concentrated in 6% of its land area, and the parts of China which have essentially modernized and industrialized are a smaller percentage, not just in terms of land area, obviously in terms of population as well. Basically, the eastern coast of China, which is where all the bubble economics is also concentrated, and which is where the SEZs were first created. Their model is basically the same. It is a model that has been adopted in all of East Asia, where you give precedence to investment over consumption, and you essentially you use the savings that are being generated from economic activity. You keep pushing that more and more into a commercial banking sector to repress real interest rates, essentially, to make it easier for firms to borrow at low cheap interest rates and to invest, and you encourage investment into specific sectors. But what happens typically is, after a while, because of way more capital going to those sectors than it should, the productivity of capital starts declining very rapidly in those sectors, and then you're faced with a problem as to what are you going to use to drive growth. So the model is not very different, and you obviously simultaneously try to climb the value chain through R&D, through industrial espionage, etc. All of them have done this, whether it be whether it be Japan, whether it be South Korea, or whether it be the People's Republic of China. Obviously, because the People's Republic of China has a much bigger population, it is facing this Japanification problem at a much lower level of per capita GDP. As far as this talk about micromanagement is concerned, it's actually China which had an advantage because it had more land under cultivation, etc. 70% of Japan's land is forest. What that means is almost 70% of Japan's net calorific requirement is imported from abroad. That was not the case with China till recently, but now China is also headed in that way, which is why it is trying to buy up commodities from wherever it can. So it is essentially the same model. It is not a very different model. It is an investment-led model which then looks at exports, because one thing that Japan learned is that you need to keep an emphasis on exports to pay for all the machinery and technology you're bringing in. And remember one thing, Japan began this path in 1868. China began it much later. But China had a different kind of world in which it could grow, a much bigger world economy. So they could rise faster also, although Japan's performance was also quite remarkable. Remember, between 1955 and 1970, Japan registered real GDP growth rate of 9.7%, compounded annual growth rate. So they also saw those miracle years, and those were led basically by investment into capital intensive sectors with new technology coming in, just as happened with in China in the 1990s and the 2000s, when they had those humongous period of growth. So it's not different per se, it's the same thing. Only problem that happens is once the productivity of capital starts declining, you invariably turn to the real estate sector for succor. So taxation, regulation, everything becomes dovetailed to promoting the real estate sector, and money starts basically starts flowing to the real estate sector both through commercial bank and shadow bank channels to that, because the rate of return in other investments goes down. And if on top of that, but you see, always all these countries, because they turn into export machines using their scale, they try to tap export markets for their worth, but there is invariably pushback against them. That pushback happened against Japan in the 70s and the 80s, and it has happened against China now since the Trump era. A proper pushback, that is. Pushback had started before that as well. So it's not that different. Let me go to some more. Okay, Raghav, what parameters or data do I need to look to understand the performance of the manufacturing sector in India? Data numbers to compare the pre and post PLI scheme. One is, of course, the rate of investment that is happening into the manufacturing sector. That will be the most important parameter initially. Whether the investment rate has actually gone up or not, and how much of it can be attributed to the PLI scheme. So obviously this is an econometric exercise. We'll have to control for other factors and see how much of it is due to the PLI scheme. Okay. Mr. Maverick Anand asks, I think by Japanification he means the massive debt burden will slow down the economy, leading to Japan-style deflation and resulting in lost decade or two. Yes, the debt burden, what happens is to these economies is they invariably start pushing money into the real estate sector. In the case of Japan also, that is what happened in after their other sectors slowed down. And in the case of Japan, what happened, first shock came in the form of the oil shock, which increased the cost of production greatly. They invested a lot, but they understood they had to restructure the economy. Although they moved into electronics, they invested in energy efficiency, but overall they knew they had to restructure their economy. They also started sending a lot of capital abroad. They made ADB in the late 60s, and ADB was very much about, all the loans they used to advance was very much tied to buying things from Japan, accepting Japanese investments, etc. So there is nothing new. BRI, AIIB, whatever China is doing is not new. ADB is the template for that also. When you look to push capital abroad, and another thing that happens to these countries, especially like Japan, and in the case of China, there are because of the repressed financial sector, there are not very many avenues to invest. So one of the places where consumers park their savings is basically the real estate sector. Okay, because there are not that many products available, and that was the case, very much the case with China, even in the 2010s. Right, so that is what happens, and then you will find that the lending is invariably done with real estate as collateral, because the expectation is that in a country which is growing like this, which has seen miracle years of growth, real estate prices will hold true. They will keep going on, especially given the favorable government environment as well. But then the bubble starts building up. Of course, the bubble doesn't only build up in the real estate sector. Once you start deregulating stock markets, the bubble builds up there as well. In the case of Japan, what happened was when they deregulated the financial sector, their firms, what they did was called the FE, the Foreign Exchange Foreign Trade Control Law. They deregulated that under American pressure, and that allowed Japanese corporations to borrow abroad, especially in the euro yen market, which allowed unsecured borrowings, and there were many things. So over time what happened was Japanese firms started borrowing less from commercial banks and borrowing more from abroad, which and they could even raise funds at lower rates than what was available in what they could do from the commercial banks in Japan. But they didn't, but ironically they used those very same funds to then lend to the commercial banks themselves. So what happened? The borrowers became the lenders. Firms who used to borrow from commercial banks instead started lending to them and parking them in these high-paying time deposits. Now what happened was banks saw a whole influx of these time deposits coming in, so they had to deploy this somewhere. And where would they deploy it? Obviously to the real estate sector, and they started deploying to lower rated firms, small and medium enterprises who earlier used to depend on cooperatives and small banks and credit unions. They started getting loans from big commercial banks in Japan. So the entire system becomes primed basically to fuel towards asset price inflation. And that is what happened in Japan and happened in China also. It begins with a model of indigenization, of export competitiveness, climbing the value chain, which they do. They simultaneously climb the value chain also. But those climbing the value chain also means that the amount of employment you can generate via the older manufacturing industries decline, which in any case are over invested. So you start looking at real estate as something that can kill many birds with one stone, not many stones, a single stone that can kill many birds. They can deal with they can serve as an outlet for your for your savings. They can serve as major employment generation zone, etc., etc. Same thing happened here in China. Now 30% of their GDP is basically directly and indirectly linked to the real estate sector. About 25% of the GDP is real estate, and 5% more with allied sectors, if I take into account allied sectors. So they are in trouble. Because it then becomes a matter of keeping the real estate sector on an even keel, which is what happened to Japan. What do? You cannot allow the bubble to keep expanding and become ever more dangerous. at the same time, you can't really bring it down quickly either, because this is now the main game in town, despite all the progress you made in high-tech sectors and so on and so forth. And America is always lurking in the background whenever it comes to an Asian challenger. They did this to the Japanese in the 1980s when they used to talk about the yellow peril and all that again. And well, they used to talk about the yellow peril earlier also, but in the 80s they restarted that. I'll give you an example. In 1987, a bunch of congressmen, they sledgehammered a Toshiba radio on the stairs of Capitol Hill. Okay, they were basically protesting Japan's decision to sell 5-axis and 9-axis machine tools to the Soviet Union's Baltic shipyard, which, as you know, was one of their main submarine shipyards in St. Petersburg. Whereas basically the Committee for Export Controls, COCOM, essentially Coordination Committee for Export Controls, that had mandated that only 2-axis machine tools could be sold to the Soviet Union by member states, which included Japan. So this was seen as a huge violation, right? And at that time, Japan was also sending a lot of capital to America, and companies were buying golf courses, and of course, you know, Sony, TriStar and all that happened in that era. So it seemed as if Japan was taking over America. So there was this huge anti-Japan sentiment which was fanned, which culminated in that first the Plaza Accord of first FTCL reform, and then the Plaza Accord of 1985, which pushed Japan towards its first growth recession called Endaka Fukio. And lo and behold, that meant that even more money was moved to the real estate sector, because the other export facing sectors were obviously suffering from high-end recession. In the case of China also, you would remember the yuan went from 14 to 9 to 6 over that whole decade, since that GFC, the period of the GFC, just before and after. And obviously China did manage to grow exports even then, but they knew that the time for this investment driven export led model was basically the time was ending. But they had no other game in town. When the 2008 crisis happened, and that exports started falling by 30%, 40% in the first 2 months, they put in place that emergency stimulus program, and the shadow of that stimulus program you see even now. Just like Japan, China has no option but to give some stimulus to reach some appropriate growth rate. But that growth rate is declining, and the productivity of stimulus is also declining. Okay, Aditya Prakash says, your prediction on the limits of the Bangladesh eco model have come true. What's the way out for them? Will greater integration with India lead to the destruction of our own textile sector? So same thing. Bangladesh had become basically another one-trick pony, textiles. Maybe they are already showing declining returns to capital in the textile sector over there, although we need more investigation into this. But the fact is that you have to have a diversified economy. You cannot have a one-trick pony. Now, what is their problem? Their problem is they are dependent on foreign sources for raw material. They don't have their own yarn. They don't have raw cotton really. Yarn, okay, maybe a little bit, but not that much. So the thing is that the best option for them would be to integrate with us. Now we can take them on, provided we invest in the right places. We should be citing our textile, those Citra parks that the government has announced, essentially in eastern India, because those places will now have even cheaper have labor that is even cheaper than Bangladesh available. So you just need to create the port connectivity over there. So we don't have to per se, we can actually take them on if we invest wisely, especially our investments are done in a proper manner, right? And obviously we have the lever. See, this is always an issue in any country. Our cotton growers want us to have a liberalized trade policy vis-a-vis Bangladesh, okay? Because they want to have another outlet for their cotton. They don't only want a domestic outlet. Obviously, our cotton yarn makers and further downstream, that is, in the case of our textile makers, they are not happy with this policy. They want Indian cotton to come to them only at, if possible, at cheaper rates than what is available elsewhere. So this tension is also there. Which are you going to privilege? Are you going to privilege the cotton growers' point of view, or are you going to privilege the value-added sector's point of view? So these are issues there. Okay, 000 YMM. Achha, this is not an IAH, so this will not go on for very long, by the way. Okay, as it is, this is Dashera time, so I'm not going to burden you guys with a long lecture on something. I just wanted to connect a little bit, get Econ Salon moving as well. In the future, we'll see more structured talks with charts and graphs and stuff like that. I'll give a full-on lecture to whoever is interested. Okay, so Alex Dilaj asks, hi, will we see a repeat of taper tantrum from 2013, or is the Indian growth story completely immune from whatever the US Fed does? It's not completely immune. You will not see a taper tantrum because the situation is very different. In 2013, your coverage in terms of forex coverage in terms of imports was worse. Your coverage of short-term debt was worse. Your level of short-term debt was higher. So a speculative attack on the rupee will not really work by anybody else. So, and what happens is when you have a speculative attack on the rupee, if it declines, it begets more outflows, right? But that won't succeed. The RBI is in a position to stabilize. Neither will we see a sudden stop where we are completely unable to finance our imports. That will not happen either. In any case, our imports are essentially covered. Our current account deficit is entirely covered by foreign direct investment. And I see that increasing to India because money has to go somewhere for growth. So we are not, but we won't be immune for the simple reason that when America goes into recession, our exports will be hit. So in that sense, we won't be immune, but we won't see balance of payments problems. Okay, Naresh Singh. Hi Saurav, what is your view on L1 tender system? Okay, we have some more questions coming in. Okay, I'll answer a few of them. I can't answer all of them because like I said, this is not IAH. I won't go on for an hour today. Maybe on a later date I might, where I'll take all your eco-related questions. So stuff like that. Okay, we have a question from Naresh Singh. Hi Saurav, what is your view on the L1 tender system? Is it doing more harm than benefit if a domestic firm is losing it only because of cost to a foreign company? It can, but then what is the alternative? There has to be a better system than taking on L1. The problem with the L1 system is exactly what you pointed out, right? A domestic firm which makes more sense from the point of view of security and even from the security of long-term supply may lose to a firm located in some other geography because of the L1 system. Then there are other problems. Maybe a firm has better tech, which will be more viable in the long term, but it may lose under the L1 system because the other firm meets all basic criteria. So some other system will have to be evolved, but it cannot be ad hoc, nor can it be something that leads to other problems. This is something worth thinking about, obviously. Okay, Gaurav Chakravarti, what is your opinion on MMT, effect of MMT in India? See, MMT cannot work because understand one thing, the economy is ultimately a convention and certain conventions have been put in place over time. It is true that you can, a government which issues its own fiat currency and has a completely accommodative central bank and doesn't care about its rate of exchange with other currencies will not go bankrupt. That is obviously true. It is also true that taxation can be used for inflation control. But whether taxation is a faster and better method for inflation control than this current method of using interest rates, that is an open question. And that is obviously a topic. This is a topic that can be taken on as a lecture on Econ Salon. I might do it. Okay, because you're right. This needs to be, MMT needs to be evaluated. But given India's position in the world, MMT should not be attempted, nor should any central banker talk about MMT, because it will only lead to foreign investors and even domestic investors basically dumping the rupee. You should not do that. Okay. Okay, Nanu Bhai says, Happy Dashera Saurav Bhai, Happy Dashera to you as well. And Suyash Chaudhary says, phone manufacturing, laptop manufacturing may be a thing to look for, but what's important is how we are able to tap subsystem manufacturing, which goes into these advanced manufacturing. Obviously, see, this is something we need to learn from Japan, China and South Korea. Okay, they also started off like this. but they worked very hard to first gain scale in terms of just the final processing, but then they also worked very hard on indigenizing the components. So they never saw import substitution and export substitution in silos. I'll give you an example. Japan used to grow some raw cotton and stuff. Its main export was silk. Remained the main export till World War II, by the way, till the beginning of World War II, silk and other tea, and there are other things they used to export. So what they did was they started bringing in Western machinery, and they started focusing on essentially cotton textiles. First they focused on yarn, then they moved up to textiles, and they became so good at it that not only did they start servicing the domestic market, they also started dominating markets in most of Asia. I'm talking about the early 20th century for this in this thing, and this process basically began in the 1870s. And to ensure that they did not have balance of payments problems, they continued with tea exports, silk exports, and exports of many other raw materials. But the exports of their manufacturers also started playing a part in evening out, in making sure they didn't have balance of payments problems. See, when you say import substitution, the big problem that happens generally is on the macro side, not on the micro side. On the micro side, productivity does increase in various industries where you do import substitution. Real wages also increase, unless you deliberately tamp them down, like in the case of China. But what happens is, because the machinery and all you don't have yourself, you import from abroad, that starts creating balance of payments problems. How do you pay for that machinery? So you have to have an export focus also simultaneously. So this is very important. This is something that should not be missed. Okay, Aditya Prakash is asking, are we overestimating the impact of demographics with respect to China? Won't increasing productivity increase offset whatever aging problem that might arise? Yes, but what increasing productivity? They are over invested in sectors where the productivity of capital is declining. They don't have TFP growth. That is exactly their problem. And they have not, and those other sectors, high value, high tech sectors, those are good, they are important, but they will not be enough to drive the economy, especially given the pushback from America. See, America dominates semiconductors and jet engine tech at the end of the day. They have made TSMC invest in that 12 billion plant in Arizona for 5 nanometer node technology also. They are at around 12% in terms of chip output, but they are everywhere in terms of the supply chain as far as IP is concerned. So Japan also moved to other high-tech industries. It moved into consumer electronics in a big way, and etc. But it was not able to sustain growth. Growth had already halved from 8% to 4%. And the only game in town becomes real estate. So that's a problem. And demographic decline is a real issue for countries which are so dependent on investment and exports. Where is this rebalance to domestic demand going to happen? Especially when export markets are receiving a major pushback, both from competitors and from others who now want to check your movement. Same thing that happened to Japan is happening to China as well. Okay, last few questions. After this, I'm going to show you a video, by the way, which I will expect all of you to promote. Enag, not related to this topic, I'm just reading a book on Kindle, loving it so far. Never knew US had an unemployment problem until I read chapter 1. Yeah, well, that is the way. It's always a question of how you basically measure unemployment. If you use more broad measures, then the unemployment rate immediately jumps, often becomes double, and that is true for many countries. European Union also has a similar kind of U3 kind of model, so their unemployment rate is also higher. Pratik Fardi says Japan has a capitalist model, on the other hand China is hybrid model, so definitely things are a bit complex to keep one on. Both have the state capitalism led model that they both adopted. If you read my book, you will see I have basically mapped the similarities in detail as to why they are the same. This is also another long topic. Okay, fine, I'll take one more question. Aditya Prakash asks, the neoliberal economist in me hasn't been able to wrap my head fully around the PLI, though I'm happy with the recent FTAs. Can you please talk about PLI and how it won't lead to an autarkic system? See, the other mistake that people who support domestic manufacturing made was they did not allow foreign firms to come in. because they wanted their own firms to build scale. But we are at a position where we don't need to do that. So we are bringing in foreign players. Foreign players have applied in the main for many PLI sectors. And when foreign players come in, the export element also comes in. So it is not autarkic in any way at all. It is clearly make in India, made for the world. It is nothing, what Japan and China did covertly and often below the radar, we are doing overtly. We are just giving incentives. We are not really blocking imports from coming in. We are not even giving tariff protection. We are removing tariff protection from certain industries. Because in any case, tariff protection does not work on an omnibus level. Tariff protection only works when you are already at a certain point where the tariff kicks in and your industry goes forward. Till of course the pushback comes from the other side. So there is always a strategic consideration involved, strategic trade theory kind of consideration involved. So we won't lead to any kind of autarky at all. We are not closing our markets. We are fully open to FDI. We are asking people to come in, use our incentives and export. And PLI is in aid of that. PLI is basically aimed to remove disabilities vis-a-vis Vietnam and China while we build up scale, while we get our infrastructure in place, while we move up the value chain in terms of R&D, etc., etc. But those things have to be done simultaneously. Otherwise, PLI can end up being just a flash in the pan. But if it is basically to buy time. In that, it all comes down to how you use that time, basically. And there's nothing wrong in that, in my view. Raghav, how different is India from East Asian countries? Also, we see many comparing India to Latin American countries. I met in this company. Where are we exactly? I want India to see as next USA. India is different. India is not an investment-driven economy. India is a consumption-driven economy, but of course, we will have to become more of an investment-driven economy, not as much as them. So obviously our consumption expenditure as a percentage of GDP will go down, maybe down to 50%, but it will never become 35% as was the case with China. China has still not hit 40% despite 15 years of attempted rebalancing. Okay, so we are not like them, we are also far less industrialized than they are. Of course, we also have problems in terms of how much we have invested in human capital and in terms of education and healthcare and all that. But I have a feeling that we can tide over those issues given the Indian industriousness. Okay, whole lot of questions are going on, but now I'll have to get out of this because like I told you, this is not and will not be for an hour. I'm going to show you guys a video. Please do see that video and then I'm going to ask you guys to promote it. So just hold on, let me play that video. Many of you might have seen this video already, but for those of you who haven't, I'll just show it anyway. And then I'll give the link. I'll ask you to promote it. This video is being actively tamped down on social media platforms, by the way, which is why those who care about the issue of Tibet and those who are part of the DDR-IH community, etc., I want you guys to do your best to try and circulate this as much as you can. Let me just show the video. 1 second.
Today, the world sees Tibet as a land struggling for autonomy within China. With tens of thousands of its people forced into exile in India and elsewhere, in the face of severe cultural repression, Tibet's fight to preserve its identity is a seemingly uphill struggle. But this was not always the case. Did you know that Tibet was once a massive empire in its own right? An empire so powerful that it could even take control of the imperial Chinese capital for a fortnight and install its own emperor. This is the story of how that happened. This is the story of how the now subjugated region of Tibet occupied the Chinese capital and even installed its own Chinese emperor. In the 21st century, the power dynamic between China and Tibet seems lopsided. But once upon a time, it was quite the opposite. According to Tibetan history, the first king to unite its many tribes was Netri Zenpo in the 2nd century BCE. Modern historians, however, believe that the era of Tibet as a powerful and unified political force came only some centuries later. This era was ushered in by Songtsen Gampo, who reigned during the first half of the 7th century CE. At this time, Tibet began competing directly with China's Tang dynasty for influence in Inner Asia. In 670 CE, Tibet's defeat of a Tang army led by General Shui Renghui would pave the way for the conquest of the buffer kingdom of Tuyuhun and bring the Tibetans into direct contact with Tang-ruled areas. With Tuyuhun secure, Tibet would see success upon success against the Tang, and by the middle of the 8th century, much of northwestern China would be in its hands. The stage was now set for the emergence of King Tisong Deten, under whom Tibetan power would reach its zenith. Deten, not merely content with consolidating Tibetan rule over conquered parts of Tang China, would set his eyes on a bigger prize. By 763 CE, the Tibetans, led by Deten, captured the strategically important area of Songchao and were now knocking at the gates of the imperial Tang capital of Chang'an, which is now known as Xi'an, famed for its terracotta soldiers. Meanwhile, in 763 CE, Tang China was in all kinds of trouble. Just years prior, a military general called An Lushan had ignited a rebellion against the imperial court, with other Tang generals subsequently taking his side. The rebellion ended, but not before it had severely weakened Daizong in particular and the Tang Empire in general. Daizong and Tang officials were not on the best of terms either, and so China was rather vulnerable, with a Game of Thrones playing out in Tang territory. Sensing Chinese weakness, Deten's Tibetans would march into the Tang capital and occupy it for a fortnight. Daizong would flee to Shanzhou, and the Tibetans would install rival Prince Li Chenggong to reign gloriously. Naturally, the local Chinese administrators didn't take particularly well to this new glorious rule, which lasted a mere fortnight. They refused to cooperate and frustrated the puppet ruler installed by the Tibetans. With news of a relief Tang army approaching, the Tibetans decided that the game was not worth the candle. Having made their point, they left after 15 days, but not before sacking the capital on their way out. Daizong returned to his throne, but the balance of power between the two empires was now clearly in Tibet's favor. Songchao was thereafter settled by Tibetans from Gari and came to be classified variously as parts of the historic Tibetan regions of Amdo or Kham. Sharkok and neighboring Khopukok remain Tibetan-speaking areas to this day. Be that as it may, Tibet was not in a position to overrun the Tang completely. Following another 60 years of sporadic fighting, the two sides would finally conclude a non-aggression treaty in 821 CE. In it, they promised to attack each other no more. Stone pillars remembering the treaty were erected in both Tibetan and Tang territory. They bore the words, "Tibet and China shall guard the present border and the territory over which they each hold sway. All to the east of the present boundary is the domain of Great China. All to the west is totally the domain of Great Tibet. Tibetans shall be happy in the land of Tibet. Chinese shall be happy in the land of China. Today, these Tibetan successes over Tang China are nothing but distant memories for the Tibetans fighting for their homeland. But the memory of this glorious past may yet serve to inspire.
Alright, so that was the video. I hope you guys like seeing it. And because of, so what I'm doing is I'm going to share the link over here. Please do your utmost to share this link wherever you can, because otherwise it's being actively tamped down on various social media platforms. I wouldn't have made such a request had it been otherwise, obviously. So do use it, do share it as much as you can, since I have seen a lot of you talking about, DDR's reach not being adequate and so on and so forth, and the need to grow the channel, etc. So I would request you to do your bit then and share this video everywhere, wherever you can, that is. And as far as today's topic is concerned, the events in China, whatever you're seeing now, has already been forecasted in the chapter 6 of my book. So it is nothing new, and I can tell you how this thing plays out. As you must have noted that while the rest of the world is in a rate hike cycle, China has actually had to drop its, drop interest rates, and it's obviously looking at the inflation rate being at 2.7% and saying that, oh, we are better off than the others. But the bottom line is that they're doing it because their non-performing loans problem is just as bad as Japan's, which had reached 25% in 1992. 25% of all bank loans had turned sour, and that is the case with China as well. And in China, here the Chinese model issue comes in. While in Japan, you had first the Zaibatsu during the Second World War, and then you had the Keiretsu. In China, the favored economic organs of the state are obviously the state-owned enterprises, and they'll be the ones who will be given the bailouts first. But this bailout will definitely lead to Chinese government, official government, public central government debt rising greatly. It will lead to China trying to hold down interest rates. At the same time, it will lead to huge capital outflows from China, which in turn will lead to more defaults of, by entities like Evergrande. More coupon, they'll miss more coupon payments because money will just dry out from the offshore bond market for most real estate developers. And like Japan, major Chinese firms are also heavily borrowed abroad, heavily leveraged abroad. So it's going to happen. You're going to see that Minsky moment, which is a sudden fall in asset prices, happen in China. The central bank will respond by pouring ever more liquidity. The yuan will be allowed to depreciate. Some defensible rate will be found with their existing reserves. But the bottom line will be that the whole system will be awash in basically bad debt. And in the case of China, what will be worse is people will not really know what has state backing and what doesn't have state backing, especially in the case of the loans given to local government financial vehicles. So there are interesting times ahead. Anyway, I do hope you like the film. Please do promote it wherever you can. I'm leaving you this evening because I'm sure you have other better things to do. But I will take up the questions you guys are raising over here, and those will be addressed in future Econ Salon episodes. And I'll also have a board and stuff like that, although I don't want to make it too academic and boring, but still. And the point is that I'll keep taking your questions, and those Econ Salon episodes will span for an hour or so, or maybe even longer, depending on the topic in question. Okay, I'm letting go now. Right. Happy Dasera to all of you. Jai Hind. Bye.